Welcome to Shadow Fable. If you love chilling tales that creep into your mind long after the lights go out, make sure to subscribe. Tonight, we unravel a story that whispers from the shadows of the ordinary, twisting reality just enough to make you wonder. What if? It started with something simple, a name, a friendly neighborly gesture. Have you met Mr. Halloway yet? Paul Turner, freshly retired and eager to settle into his new home, shook his head as he watched the woman from next door trim her hedges. She was in her late 60s, well kept, the sort of woman who seemed to be involved in everything that happened on the block. He had only moved in 3 days ago, and this was their first conversation. "No," Paul admitted. "I don't think I've seen him." "Oh, you will," she said with a knowing smile. "He's been here longer than any of us, a real fixture. Keeps to himself mostly, but always around when you need him." Paul nodded politely. He wasn't the type to pry, and besides, there was something comforting about a quiet neighbor. His last home had been surrounded by young families, kids running up and down the sidewalk, car doors slamming at all hours. Here, it was peaceful. That night, after unpacking the last of his books, he stepped out onto his porch for some fresh air. The neighborhood was silent, save for the occasional distant bark of a dog. Across the street, a single dim light glowed from the house directly opposite his. That must be Mr. Halloway's place. Paul squinted into the darkness, half expecting to see a shadow pass by the window, but there was nothing. Just the faint flicker of what looked like candlelight. Odd, but not unreasonable. Maybe the guy liked to keep things old-fashioned. The days passed uneventfully. Paul settled into a routine. Morning coffee on the porch, afternoon walks through the tree-lined streets, evenings spent in his armchair with a book. Occasionally, he asked about Mr. Halloway in casual conversation with other neighbors. The responses were always the same. "He's a good man, been here forever." Always helpful when you need him. But when Paul pressed for details, what did he do for a living? What did he look like? Had anyone actually spoken to him recently? The answers became vague. "Oh, quiet type. Doesn't like to be bothered much. He's around, though." It was strange, Paul thought, how everyone seemed to remember Mr. Halloway, but no one had anything concrete to say about him. No one even mentioned seeing him in the past few weeks. And yet, they all insisted he was there. One evening, curiosity got the better of him. He decided to take a walk past Mr. Halloway's house. Just a casual stroll, nothing suspicious. The house was old but well-maintained, modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and a few potted plants on the porch. Nothing about it stood out. No car in the driveway, no movement inside, but the porch light was on, casting a warm glow onto the steps. Paul lingered for a moment, listening. Silence. Then, just as he turned to leave, something moved behind the lace curtains. A shape, a presence. He felt it before he saw it. A flicker of movement. A figure just beyond the sheer fabric. Paul's breath caught. His pulse quickened. The curtain shifted, but no face appeared. No hand reached up to part the fabric. Then the light inside flickered out, plunging the house into darkness. Paul took a step back, his skin prickling. He was being watched, he was sure of it. And yet, nothing happened. No door creaked open, no voice called out. Feeling suddenly foolish, he shook his head and walked briskly back to his own house, shutting the door behind him with a bit more force than necessary. That night, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling, trying to shake the feeling that something was off. That Mr. Halloway, whoever he was, had seen him, and chosen not to be seen in return. The following day, he made a point to watch the house from his porch. Hours passed. No movement. No visitors. No sign of life at all. And yet, by nightfall, the porch light was back on. Paul frowned. Who was turning it on? And why did no one seem to think this was strange? Something wasn't right. And Paul intended to find out what. The next morning, Paul decided to take a more direct approach. If no one had seen Mr. Holloway recently, perhaps it was time someone checked in on him. After all, he was an older man. Maybe he needed help. Maybe he wasn't even in the house anymore and no one had noticed. That thought unsettled him more than he cared to admit. By mid-afternoon, he found himself standing at Holloway's doorstep. Up close, the house looked even more ordinary. Too ordinary, in fact. There was no mail piled up, no newspapers cluttering the steps. Everything was neat, as though someone was actively maintaining it. Paul raised his fist and knocked. The sound echoed hollowly through the house. He waited. Nothing. Another knock. Still nothing. Then, just as he turned to leave, the porch light flickered on. It was broad daylight. Paul's stomach dropped. He spun back around, his pulse hammering in his throat. The light was definitely on. He hadn't imagined it, but the door remained shut. His breath came out slow and measured as he scanned the windows. The lace curtains were still, unmoving. Someone was inside, or something was. He swallowed, debating whether to knock again, but something inside him, something primal, told him to leave, and so he did. For the next few days, Paul tried to push the incident from his mind. He went back to his routine, forcing himself not to glance across the street, not to linger on the questions gnawing at him. But they lingered anyway. The neighbors, didn't they think it was strange? The way they spoke about Mr. Holloway as if he were still around, despite no one having actually seen him? One evening, at the local grocery store, Paul found himself behind his next-door neighbor, the woman who had first mentioned Holloway. "Mrs. Winters," he said carefully, "when's the last time you saw Mr. Holloway face to face?" She gave him a peculiar look. "Oh, well," she hesitated. "Not recently, I suppose, but he's still there." Paul's mouth went dry. "How do you know?" Mrs. Winters frowned, as though the question itself was offensive. "Because he always is." The finality in her tone sent a chill through him. It was then that he realized. No one questioned it. No one wanted to. That night, Paul sat by his window, staring at Holloway's house. The porch light flickered on precisely at 9 p.m., as if on cue. He clenched his jaw. He needed proof. By midnight, he was back on the street, standing just outside the front yard. The house loomed before him, silent, waiting. He reached into his pocket, fingers wrapping around his phone. A simple knock had done nothing. But what if he took it further? Carefully, he stepped off the sidewalk onto the grass. A warm breeze stirred the air. His heart pounded. One step, another. He placed a cautious foot onto the porch. The wood groaned beneath him. His throat tightened. The door was mere inches away now, and then the porch light flickered, not off, not fully. Just enough to pulse, like a slow, dying heartbeat. Paul froze. His mouth opened, but no words came out. And then, from inside the house, he heard something. A whisper, a breath. It was close. Right on the other side of the door. The porch light went out. Paul staggered back, his foot catching on the step. His phone tumbled from his grasp, landing on the wood with a soft thud. And then, The doorknob turned. Paul's breath hitched. His body screamed at him to run, but he couldn't move. His feet felt rooted to the spot as the doorknob twisted further. Slow, deliberate. Someone's inside. The thought sent a shiver through his spine. He had convinced himself that the house was empty, that maybe the neighbors had simply been remembering a man long gone. But this was real. The door didn't open all the way, just a crack, barely an inch. Enough for Paul to see the darkness beyond. Enough for him to hear the faintest creak of old wood shifting. His heartbeat hammered against his ribs as he forced himself to speak. "Mr. Holloway?" Silence. Then a whisper. Low. Indistinct. Like someone trying to remember how to form words. Paul took a slow step back. His body was screaming at him to turn and run, but he hesitated just long enough to see something shift in the darkness beyond the door. A shadow. Tall. Unmoving. Not stepping forward. Not receding. Just waiting. A cold sweat broke out along Paul's skin. He bent down slowly, fingers trembling as he reached for his phone. His hand barely grazed it when the door slammed shut. The porch light flickered back on. Paul jerked upright, heart pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His phone lay on the porch, but there was no way in hell he was stepping forward to grab it. Without another second of hesitation, he turned on his heel and bolted back across the street. He didn't stop until he was safely inside his own house. The door locked, his back pressed against it. His breaths came in ragged gasps. He forced himself to look out the window. The porch light across the street was glowing, as though nothing had happened. The house was still, silent. And then, the lace curtain shifted. Paul didn't sleep that night. The next morning, he tried to convince himself that he had imagined it, that it had been some trick of the mind, some strange delusion brought on by the eerie nature of the house. But when he stepped onto his porch, still shaken, his phone was there, neatly placed, right in the center of his welcome mat. The screen was on. A single notification. New contact added, Mr. Holloway. Paul's hands went numb. He swallowed hard, staring at the screen, then slowly, hesitantly tapped the contact. No number, no photo, just the name. And below it, a single message. "I see you too." Paul dropped the phone. A chill ran through his bones, deeper than anything he had ever felt before. He wasn't just being watched. He had been acknowledged. Paul's stomach twisted as he stared at the phone on the porch, its screen still glowing with those 3 chilling words. "I see you too." He didn't want to touch it, didn't want to pick it up. But leaving it there felt worse. His fingers trembled as he reached down, snatching the device as if it might burn him. He tapped the screen, his breath shallow. The message was still there. No timestamp, no number, no way to reply. His first instinct was to delete it, wipe the contact, pretend it never appeared. But what if that made things worse? He glanced across the street at Holloway's house. The porch light was still on, casting a dim glow in the morning light. The curtains hung motionless in the window. He swallowed hard and backed into his house, locking the door behind him. This was absurd. Maybe someone was messing with him. Maybe one of the neighbors had noticed his curiosity and decided to scare him. Maybe... His phone buzzed in his hand. A second message. "Don't look away too long." Paul's breath caught. His body stiffened, as if something, someone, were right behind him. He spun, scanning the room. Nothing. Just his furniture, his books, the same walls he had unpacked against just days ago. His pulse pounded in his ears. He needed answers. Screw it. Paul grabbed his keys and stormed across the street. His fear was a cold weight in his stomach, but he buried it under frustration. If someone was inside that house playing games with him, he was going to get to the bottom of it. He pounded on the door. Nothing. He knocked again, harder. "Mr. Holloway?" Silence. He reached for the doorknob, hesitating. It wouldn't be locked. He knew it wouldn't be. His fingers brushed the metal. Cold, almost wet. A deep, sick feeling settled in his chest as he turned it. The door swung open. The air inside was thick, heavy, wrong. The house smelled of dust, old wood, something faintly sweet and rotting beneath it all. Sunlight barely cut through the drawn curtains, casting weak beams of light onto the wooden floor. Paul stepped inside. His pulse thudded. The place was still. Not just empty, still. Like a house long abandoned, where time had forgotten to move. But there was no dust, no cobwebs, no sign that it had been untouched. The furniture was arranged neatly. A coat hung by the door. The carpet was clean, recently vacuumed. Paul's breath came in short, uneven bursts. He moved deeper inside. The living room. A simple couch. A coffee table with an old newspaper folded neatly on top. He stepped closer, squinting at the date. July 12th, 1956. The ink looked fresh, the pages crisp. Paul's hands clenched into fists. A creak echoed from the hallway. His breath hitched. Slow, deliberate footsteps. Coming closer. Paul's heart slammed against his ribs. The hallway led deeper into the house, vanishing into shadow. The footsteps stopped. And then, a whisper. "You shouldn't be here." Paul turned. But the door was already swinging shut. Paul lunged for the door, his fingers outstretched. Too late. It shut with a quiet but final click. The silence that followed was thick, oppressive. The air felt denser, as though the walls themselves were closing in. His breath came shallow. He reached for the doorknob, gripping it tight. He twisted. It didn't budge. Locked. Paul's pulse pounded in his ears. He hadn't heard a key turn, hadn't heard anything mechanical. It had just sealed itself. Behind him, the house creaked, wood settling like something shifting deep within its bones. He turned slowly. The hallway yawned before him, stretching into shadow. The space beyond was wrong. Too dark, as if the light from the front windows refused to touch it. And then, a sound. Software. Deliberate. Footsteps. Not from the hallway, from behind him. Paul stiffened, his entire body locking in place. The door was at his back. Nothing was between him and the wall, and yet, a step, another. Right behind his ear, a whisper of breath. Paul spun, his back slamming into the wood. His hands fumbled for the knob, for anything, but there was nothing there. Nothing but empty air. He was alone. He should have been alone. But the feeling, that prickling, creeping awareness remained. He wasn't alone. The realization settled into his bones like ice water. Slowly, carefully, Paul turned back toward the hallway. The newspaper still sat on the coffee table. The furniture remained untouched. And yet, something had changed. The hallway was shorter, or rather, the shadows had moved closer. Paul swallowed hard, his throat dry. The darkness at the end of the hall pulsed, thick and liquid-like, swallowing the space beyond. Something was in there, watching, waiting. A breath shuddered out of Paul's lungs. He took a step back. The floorboard under his foot groaned. The darkness in the hallway shifted. Not a trick of the light, not a shadow cast by something unseen. It moved. Paul clenched his jaw. His mind screamed at him to leave, to get out. But there was only one way forward. He took a step. The darkness remained still. Another. His foot barely touched the ground before the whisper returned. "You shouldn't have come." The voice slithered through the air, curling around him like a slow-moving fog. Paul's throat tightened. It wasn't a threat, it was a warning. He moved closer. The air grew heavier, pressing against his skin like unseen hands, and then, barely perceptible, something peeked from the shadows. Just the outline of a face. A shape. A suggestion of features. Eyes hollow and wide, mouth slack, frozen as if caught in mid-speech. It was watching him, and it had been there the whole time. Paul's breath stilled. The figure didn't move, didn't speak. But the whisper returned, closer this time, impossibly close. "Go home." Paul didn't hesitate. He turned. He ran. The locked door should have stopped him. But as he reached it, the knob twisted beneath his fingers, the wood groaning as it opened itself. Cold air rushed past him as he stumbled out onto the porch, his lungs heaving. The house was silent. Nothing followed, nothing chased. Behind him, the door swung shut. The porch light flickered off. Paul backed away, his steps unsteady as he crossed the street to his own house, slamming the door behind him. His heart pounded. His mind screamed at him to make sense of what had just happened. But there was no sense to be made. His phone buzzed in his pocket. Paul flinched. Slowly, he pulled it out. A new message. From Mr. Holloway. "Don't knock again." Paul stared, his breath unsteady. And then, almost against his will, his gaze drifted toward the window. The house across the street was dark. The curtains were still. But somewhere, deep in the shadows, something shifted. And Paul knew, with a bone-deep certainty, Mr. Holloway was watching. And this time, he wouldn't be ignored.